kind of eerie. When ESPN came on the scene, how did local news react to a 24-hour channel dedicated to just sports?
Well, that's a very good question, because and that's a good question too, because what that did was that people could watch. When I was growing up, it had to be very special to be on television, and now everything is on television. If the NC State North Carolina Central game wasn't on television, people want to know why. Why isn't it on? Even though it's not the greatest game of all time. And so people expect things to be on television. What ESPN did was they had a national sports show that showed nothing but sports. And so that made the local stations have to become more local. But here's what I contend. TV consultants would come down and say, well, nobody's watching local sports because everybody's watching ESPN. That's not true, because I see the ratings every day, and ESPN Sports Center, say at 6 o'clock in our market, would have like maybe they'd be lucky to have what they call a 1 rating and a 2 share, whereas our 6 o'clock news at WRAL might have a 14 rating and a 25, 26, 27 share. So you can't tell me that all sports fans are watching ESPN. But ESPN made us probably do a better job of covering things locally, because we knew nationally that people would probably tune in to watch ESPN.
Now, tell me about your experiences covering the Duke-Carolina rivalry. Of course, Coach K, and then, of course, the legendary Dean Smith when he was at Carolina.
Well, I'll tell you what. See, the Duke-Carolina rivalry for me, Jarrell, goes way back to when I was growing up. I was a Duke fan growing up in Rocky Mount, which is a Carolina town. And I was a Duke fan because my dad went to Duke. He went to Duke undergraduate and medical school. He was a doctor in Rocky Mount. And so back in the early 60s, he got season tickets to Duke games. So still, to me, the most memorable Duke-Carolina game that I recall was the February 4th, 1961. It was the famous game. Frank McGuire's coaching North Carolina. Vic Bubas is coaching Duke. Art Heyman is Duke's sophomore star. Carolina has Larry Brown, who now is the coach of the Bobcats, a Hall of Fame coach. They had Larry Brown, Doug Moe, York Larisi, Donnie Walsh, who's now runs the New York Knicks, and they had the huge fight at the end of the game in which people just poured out on the court, and Doug Moe's at midcourt taking on all comers. It was amazing, and I was a 12-year-old kid, just sitting there, just watching this, mesmerized. And so I can recall just about all the Duke-Carolina games. There have been just so many great ones. I remember in 1966, the famous game in the ACC tournament when Duke was the better team and Carolina held the ball, and Duke ended up winning in the ACC semifinals 21-20. The 1969 ACC tournament championship when Duke was up by 9 at half and as many as 11 in the second half, and Charlie Scott had 28 of his 40 points in the second half as Carolina won to win their third straight ACC tournament. The 72 game in which Cameron Indoor Stadium was named from Duke Indoor Stadium to Cameron Indoor Stadium. Carolina's third in the country. They have Bob McAdoo, and Duke wins at the buzzer on a Robbie West, a very journeyman basketball player, his shot at the buzzer. 74, the famous Walter Davis game that when he tied it up when Carolina's down 8 points with 17 seconds left and rallies to win in overtime. And you can just go on and on with the number of great games. And then it really became big when ESPN came on, and there's Mike Krzyzewski against Dean Smith, and they had some heated games in that series. It's just, it just goes on and on and on. It's just a great series that has caught the imagination of the country, and you got two schools about 8 miles apart, and the schools basically have very little in common. Carolina's a large public university. Duke's a small or private institution, but boy, do they go at it in basketball.
Because I remember those classic 90s games when Krzyzewski had Hurley, Hill, Leitner, and, of course, all the other guys that Dean Smith had. And who can forget Eric Montross being bloody, Wojo slapping the floor, and the list goes on and on. There's too many moments.
Well, that 92 game with Eric Montross, he's bloodied, and, Duke only lost twice that whole year, and one of them was to Carolina. And Duke got him back at the end of the regular season in the ACC tournament. And that was the second of their back-to-back national championships. 1991, both Duke and Carolina, for the only time, were in the Final Four together. And Carolina played Kansas, Duke played UNLV, and Kansas really upset Roy Williams was the Kansas coach. Dean Smith was the Carolina coach, and Kansas upset Carolina in that first semifinal game. And I remember Coach Krzyzewski, Duke was getting ready to take the floor, and Coach Krzyzewski said, "Listen, are you guys more relaxed now that Carolina is lost?" And you know, you could see Brian Davis and some of the Duke players, you know, kind of nod, and yeah, they were more relaxed. And Coach Krzyzewski says, "Well, I don't want you relaxed. We're going to go out there." And he kept saying, you know, they're playing UNLV, who's undefeated, and Coach K says, we're not going to be relaxed. We're going to go out there and show these guys something. And you know, and they upset UNLV, undefeated. Everybody thought UNLV was going to cap an undefeated season in the year before, of course, Jarrell, in the championship game in 1990, UNLV beat Duke by 30 points.
That was when UNLV, coached by Jerry Tarkanian, they had Stacey Augmon, Greg Anthony, Larry Johnson.
Yep.
And then, of course, in 1993, the infamous timeout, Chris Webber and the 5-5 taking on Carolina. And Carolina was kind of heated because Chris Webber got away with a walk. And then, of course,
yeah, you're talking about the end of the game. He sure did get away with the walk, but you know, 10 seconds later, it was
it didn't matter.
A bit of difference because Weber called timeout, and they didn't have one, and there's the ball game right there. And Michigan, frankly, you know, when you look at it, they may have had the better team, but Donald Williams, I talked about earlier about the extra effort award. Donald Williams was an extra effort award winner, and he was a sophomore at Carolina in 93 and was the most valuable player of the Final Four from Garner. He shot lights out, and that was Dean Smith's second national championship.
And it seems like with the history between Duke and Carolina, you would think, you know, both schools would have kind of like UCLA status with multiple championships, but it's a rich history. But also heard that back when Jordan was playing, a lot of people were kind of skeptical, didn't really think Jordan was going to be what he was in the pros.
Well, you know what, the standard joke was the only person who could hold Michael Jordan under 20 points was Dean Smith, because Dean Smith played that, you know, he didn't have the star system. And so Michael Jordan, you know, his talents were, but it's a funny thing, you know, when he was a freshman, you know, you could tell he was good. And he hit the shot that beat Georgetown in 1982. But that summer, they had played pickup games over at Carmichael Auditorium, and Jay Jennings from our staff went over to do a story about all the pros coming back to Chapel Hill to play in these pickup games. And he came back from watching one of them, and he said, and Walter Davis was there, and Phil Ford was there, and Mitch Kupchak was there. You know, just a whole group of players, you know, who were in the pros from Carolina. And he said Michael Jordan was the best. This was before his sophomore year. He said the guy was incredible. He was better than anybody on the court.